Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. I am your host, Dr. Panel. Today it is just me, no co-host. It's been a long time away from the recording and a long time away from the podcast in general. I would like to thank everyone who stuck by me and supported the podcast as it was going through a little bit of changes. Today we got a big episode, real big episode. Might be a two-parter, probably will be a two-parter, maybe a three or four parter, depending on if we combine the second with the first. But today's episode is about Marvel Civil War. The original comic run started in 2006 to 2007. We're just going to be breaking it down and kind of explaining what happened in it and what the comic itself's about and the impact of the comic on the greater Marvel universe as a whole. Alrighty, so obviously the Civil War comic, as everyone, if you're listening to this, should know, is basically Captain America versus Iron Man. Much like the movie turned out, obviously on a much smaller scale and much fewer characters and, in my opinion, losses. So I'd like to start off with just kind of explaining what started the book in general, what the beginning of it was, and what led to most of, if not all, the events in the book. It's a very big cause and effect kind of thing. It starts off with the New Warriors, a reality TV style team that confronts the villains in Stamford, Connecticut. The villain Nitro explodes, killing 600 plus civilians. Obviously, that's a lot of people, a lot of innocent lives lost. After this event, after the New Warriors are able to stop them, this is a big public problem. Obviously, superheroes have caused, not directly purposeful, but they've caused a lot of civilian casualties throughout the time of them existing and the time of them fighting crime and protecting the city. Obviously, there's been a lot of casualties, a lot of innocent lives that have been lost. This particular thing started a lot of public outrage all over the United States, all over the world, really. So much outrage, in fact, that the superheroes were officially labeled as a national threat to the national safety of the United States, other countries, just everywhere in general. What does this mean? It basically means that these people that we once looked at as here to save the day, here to protect us, here to keep us safe, weren't as really looked at like that anymore at all. They were looked at as pariahs. They were looked at as, if not the villains, a casualty of the villains. They are here because they are trying to protect us, but at the end of the day it ends up just hurting us more than anything. Obviously, in the Captain America Civil War movie, a similar thing happens. Scarlet Witch, they're trying to take down Crossbones and his men, and she stops a bomb from exploding in the middle of the street and tries to toss it up in the air to get rid of it, and it explodes a building, taking a lot of casualties, human lives. Not on as big of a scale as the comic book. They don't have all the rights to the characters. They don't have all the rights to a lot of the stuff, so they couldn't do it how they did it in the comic. Of course, similar thing in the movie. This, and in the comic, this leads to the U.S. government passing the Superhuman Registration Act. In the movie, I believe it's the Sokovia Accords. Basically the same thing, meaning all superpowered individuals must reveal their real identities, register with the government, and receive formal training to make sure there's less casualties and that they're not just wandering free to do whatever they please. That's basically what that is. And after that gets passed, basically the heroes don't have many options. They either have to register, they have to retire, or go on the run, basically. Obviously that's not a legal option, but that is what eventually a lot of them do choose to do. It's no longer like a theoretical thing. It's the law. They have to. They don't have really a choice in the matter once this is passed. Obviously, there's going to be heroes that aren't willing, as you will see later on in this breakdown, but it's basically how it is. Don't have much of a choice. So before we get too far into it, this is absolutely one of my favorite Marvel stories that I've ever read. I think it's a very complex story, and it kind of understand each side, which is cool. I like when it's not just cut and dry, good and evil. And especially I think that's important for a story like this, because if you only really could understand the one side of it, or be on the one side of it, then I think it would make it a lot less intriguing than it ended up being. And that's the one issue I kind of have with the movie, if that makes sense, just because, for one, there's not as many characters, but for two, I think what they took out of the story for the movie takes away a lot of the being able to see both points of view and understand and be able to kind of get behind both points of view. As we get deeper into this deep dive, you'll kind of see what I'm saying about that, but I think specifically for a story of this nature, I think it's so important for you to be able to understand both sides. And I think they did a really good job with that. But to get back into the story, after all of that goes down, after the Sokovia Accords or the Superhuman Registration Act, it's kind of when people start picking sides. For the pro registration, it's Iron Man, Mr. Fantastic, Hank Pym, She-Hulk, Yellow Jacket, Black Widow. Some of these sides will change or get a little bit more twisted later on, but for the most part, that's the beginning of the pro registration side. And then for the anti-registration side, it would be Captain America, Falcon, Luke Cage, Daredevil, Spider-Woman, the Young Avengers, and then Punisher. For the pro-registration side, their main reason for choosing that side is that they believe power demands accountability. This prevents worse crackdowns later, like what happened earlier in the story. For the anti-registration side, they believe that forced registration violates civil liberties and endangers families, which realistically it does, because if you have to, especially for ones that with the secret identities, if you reveal your secret identity, it's a likely chance that the people you love or care about are going to become the targets, obviously. So I was saying a minute ago, it's pretty understandable to be able to understand both sides, or pretty easy to be able to understand both sides. It kind of depends on how you look at it or how you think about it. But honestly, I think the biggest thing to come out of this comic book, at least in my opinion, is what happens next, which is Iron Man convinces Peter Parker to publicly reveal his identity as Spider-Man. Spider-Man unmasks on TV, revealing his name to be Peter Parker. This becomes a real symbolic and like a big point, the pro-registration side. Later, obviously, Peter kind of will realize the cost of revealing his secret identity, with villains targeting his family and stuff of that nature. This decision, we'll talk about later on the long-term effects of the book in general, but this decision does go on to kind of affect a lot of books and stories afterwards, with Peter revealing his secret identity. Obviously, because before this, it's never been done. It hasn't been done in really any form of comics. Obviously, we knew his secret identity as the reader, but no, it wasn't a public thing until this book. To be able to hold the superheroes that end up resisting the registration or they need a capture, Reed Richards and Tony create Prison 42 in the negative zone. Unregistered or detained heroes will go there without a trial. There is no legal system in this case. It's all what they're doing is illegal, so that's where they're going to go. Real Thor is off-world during this story, so he has nothing to do with it, but Tony builds a Thor clone called Ragnarok, who he deploys to help capture the evading superheroes. This ends up being something he regrets later. Ragnarok kills Goliath during a battle, which leads to a lot of problems. It makes tensions grow a lot harsher and a lot more throughout the story. That's one big reason that Tony ends up regretting even calling upon Ragnarok. And then this is also kind of where the pro-registration side loses their moral standing, because they're here to kind of control and keep the heroes in line, and then you have this guy just go and publicly murder a well-known superhero not on TV, but it happened in front of everybody, so that was quite a issue. So this part's getting added. Another reason, in my opinion, why Ragnarok killing Goliath was such a big deal and it's such a kind of a bad look for the Pro-Registration Act, because Captain America already kind of drew a hard line, moral line in the sand for his people, at least, that there is no killing, which is obviously a bit different compared to a lot of superheroes. Like, for example, Punisher joins Captain America's crew before this all happens, and he obviously kills, so this also kind of starts making people that are already pro, like superheroes that are already pro-registration, kind of shaky. They already are not too sure about it in general, so after something like that happens, they kind of cause them to question what they're doing. for lack of a better term, kind of wonder or try to decide what's the right path here. Did we make the right choice? Things like of that nature. And then coming back to what I was saying earlier with Peter revealing his secret obviously causes his family to be in a lot more immense danger. A villain attacks and leaves Aunt May critically wounded. And I say villain because, and not like a specific person, because technically Kingpin is the one who does it. He sees Spider-Man and then now Peter Parker as a threat to his power, basically. So he hires a hitman to take out Peter. Peter was the intended goal for the sniper, but he ended up missing and hitting Aunt May, which left her critically wounded. Peter, obviously upset and distraught about this, he confronts Tony, realizes how far Iron Man has gone and then is willing to go for his cause. And Spider-Man defects and joins Captain America. The moral center of kind of the group, if you think about it that way, jumps to the other side. I mentioned obviously before that there's the negative zone prison. There is no trials, no oversight, just containment. There is nothing stopping the people running the prison from doing basically whatever they feel like doing. This eventually leads to New York City, where Captain America's forces launch an all-out attack. It's heroes versus heroes in the streets. Civilians are caught in the middle. Exactly what the entire act in general was to stop and, keep from happening. This eventually leads to Captain America defeating Iron Man physically in their fight. But Captain America sees EMTs, firefighters, terrified civilians begging them to stop. This kind of puts in perspective what Captain America's what led to all this, what caused big fallout, what caused the fallout with the Avengers, other superheroes in general. Cap realizes that the fight is causing exactly what the SRA feared. He stops, he surrenders voluntarily, his team is arrested. Basically the entire war ends, but not really a victory. It's kind of exhaustion more than anything. They both, not really Tony at this point, but Captain America at least realizes what he's done and what's happening and how much of a moral quandary this causes. And then, that's kind of where the story itself ends. Registration remains law. Pro-registration side won, but at a massive cost, obviously. Cap is jailed. The hero community is broken as we know it. This directly leads into so many different stories, and I'm going to kind of go through that, what it ends up, the effects it has on the rest of the Marvel Universe in general. If you want my opinion, I don't think, at least not here, Tony didn't really learn his lesson. He didn't really see the error of his ways as much as I think he should have. They didn't do as good of a job breaking down him or making his character really see the error in his ways as much as they did everyone else. Spider-Man, for example, he revealed his identity. Someone he loved got hurt, and it caused him to rethink Captain America. He watched Goliath die. He watched all these innocent people terrified and scared for their lives as the war was happening, as the fight was happening, and he realized that this is exactly what this whole thing was about. This whole thing was created to stop this from happening, and it's happened anyway. But like I said, that was the end of the book, but that wasn't the end of the story, but it wasn't really the end of the story. Civil War doesn't really end. It bleeds into everything that comes after it. For example, Captain America is killed. Steve Rogers is arrested after surrendering. On the courthouse steps, he's assassinated right before his trial. The shooter, this is kind of an interesting one, is a brainwashed Sharon Carter, triggered by the Red Skull's allies. So basically, the people that have been trying to get Captain America this entire time finally got him. The symbolic hero, basically, he kind of represents our country, is gone. He's dead. This alone, I think, has a big hit on Marvel in general as a whole. It reshapes a lot of things that come afterward. The Superhuman Registration Act stays. It remains the law. Unregistered heroes are still criminals. Some heroes retire. Others operate illegally. A few leave the country or go off-world to continue doing what they're doing outside of the boundaries or barriers of the Registration Act. The winning side doesn't really feel like winners because as much as they got what they wanted, they lost too much in general to feel like they did really succeed. Again, though, other than Tony Stark, he's kind of just keeps on moving, keeps on prospering. Tony Stark is appointed the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. He's now enforcing the law he helped create. Former friends see him as a government enforcer, not a hero. That's what the people in the streets are seeing too. The civilians, they don't see him like a hero anymore as they used to. His guilt over Cap's death quietly wrecks him, but he, in the public face and the public image, he keeps all of that behind. He doesn't exactly show that any of this has affected him or will affect him in any way. But this does kind of set up his downfall in general. Shortly after this, the negative zone prison becomes public knowledge. Detention without trial is normalized. Some pro-registration heroes begin defecting or quitting to join the other side, and well, there isn't really another side anymore. They just defect and either become heroes on the run also, or they retire in general. Reed Richards' reputation is permanently damaged. A lot of people don't see him as the same way they did. They don't see the Fantastic Four the same way they did. The line between hero and state weapon is very blurred, with obviously the people that are still enforcing the Registration Act. People don't see any of them really as heroes anymore. They see them as weapons for the government to control, weapons for the government to do the government's bidding. And then obviously the straight to mind aftermaths of everything is the Avengers splitting. The Fantastic Four are fractured because Sue Storm was actually on the opposite side. I didn't mention that because it wasn't a big part of it in my opinion, but she was on Cap's side. The street level heroes all go underground. They go into hiding, for lack of a better term. The trust in general in basically all of the heroes are gone after we literally witnessed all of them fighting over this, what they try to keep us from. Heroes hesitate before answering calls. Unity between the heroes in general is just dead. The Marvel Universe wasn't the same for a really long time after the events of Civil War. And then, realistically, Spider-Man's life, just to get back to him for a minute, is basically ruined. I mean, obviously Aunt May survived, but she was critically wounded. Peter goes after the Kingpin, which leads to the Back in Black storyline. I do think that's one of the best Spider-Man arcs of all time. He publicly rejects Iron Man, and his secret identity is no longer safe. Everyone's aware of it since he did it on national television. All of this eventually leads to the One More Day comic arc, which it's a really controversial comic arc. There's not a lot of people that like it. I think it's a pretty decent read, but I can understand why people aren't too big fans of it. And then obviously without these superhero teams or these superheroes just out in the open in general to kind of keep these villains at bay, it comes the rise of the villains. Heroes are busy policing each other, villains exploit the chaos, crime syndicates expand, supervillains get bolder. The world is much less safe after Civil War than it was before Civil War, which again is the complete opposite of what the Superhuman Registration Act or the Scovia Accords or whatever you want to call it was made for in general. It was there to make the world safer and keep the heroes in line. Absolutely failed in that directive. This eventually all leads to World War Hulk. Hulk returns to Earth furious. The fractured hero community can't respond effectively because they're not together. They're not a unity like they used to be. Their disunity makes the crisis worse. Civil War directly weakens Earth's defenses. And then another big spin-off effect from Civil War storyline is the Secret Invasion that happens because of Civil War. This is huge. This is really, really huge. The Skrulls had infiltrated Earth during the Civil War. Obviously, they were too busy fighting each other to even notice it. Heroes were distracted and mistrustful. No unified response. Invasion succeeds because of the fractures Civil War caused. Nick Fury straight up says this, but none of this would have happened if Civil War didn't happen. None of this would have happened if the heroes had stayed united, stayed together, stayed doing what they were doing. All of this is a direct effect and direct aftermath of all of that, all of the Civil War. Another effect of Civil War would be the Dark Reign story. Norman Osborn kills the Skrull Queen, becomes head of the global security. Iron Man is hunted. Registration is twisted into authoritarian control. Kind of led from Civil War, Secret Invasion, Dark Reign. Kind of all leads together. It's all one, not story, but straight line connecting the events of all of this. Obviously, with the Captain America mantle, I don't want to say up for grabs, but with Steve Rogers dead, Bucky Barnes becomes Captain America. The role becomes more about ideals, not symbols. I never liked Bucky Barnes as Captain America. I think they did a better job in the comics showing his redemption arc, but in the movies at least, I would have been absolutely against him becoming Captain America. But even the impacts don't really stop there. Even when Steve Rogers does eventually return and comes back from the dead, because they redo that stuff all the time, it doesn't erase the damage. It doesn't get rid of the consequences of Civil War in general. Captain America's death kind of becomes a moral scar on the universe as a whole. And honestly, it ended up kind of just turning out that Civil War wasn't really about laws versus chaos. It was really more about fear rewriting heroism. At the end, I mean, the public didn't trust the heroes. Heroes couldn't trust each other. The world is so much more vulnerable than it was before. It truly, it's one of the most impactful events to happen in Marvel, and it led on to so many good stories, bad stories, crazy consequences. I'm sure there's one or two, but can't really think of any other story that had such big, long-lasting consequences on the universe in general than Civil War. And it's one of my favorite stories of all time. Again, like I was saying earlier, I think it absolutely was so important for you to be able to understand both sides, and I think it was important for them to be able to tackle, even afterwards, the effects that things like this can cause. Obviously, the biggest thing that they wanted to do with the Superhuman Registration Act was make the world more safe. It could not have went any more in the opposite direction than that, which I think is these kind of stories to me are really important because they don't necessarily directly correlate to real life, but it does really make you think about stuff happening in real life. It is a lot of the times in the world when we try to go out of our way to do things to get this ground-changing outcome or just earth-shattering outcome, it does a lot of the times tend to lead in opposite directions than you would have normally wanted to go or wanted to end up happening. And that's kind of the casualty of war. Obviously, people hear that all the time, casualty of war, but for this war specifically, in the Civil War comic, there couldn't have been much more casualties. Not just people's death, not just people's morals, but it's just the world at large was so much less safe than it was originally, and it was a long road to come back from it. It took a long time to get back to, and I'd argue that they still never got back to what they were before. But that's basically it for the first Civil War. I know I wrapped up the original Civil War, and we're going to move on here to Civil War 2. Still not too sure if I'm going to separate this episode into two parts or if it's just going to be the one big part. But I forgot to mention most of the list for the heroes on each side, so I'll do that now. For the pro-registration side, the main people on Iron Man's side was obviously Iron Man, Mr. Fantastic, Hank Pym, She-Hulk, Black Widow, Miss Marvel, The Vision, Wonder Woman, Songbird, Ares, and Moon Knight. And then for the anti-registration side, which would be Cap's side, it was Captain America, obviously, then Falcon, the Winter Soldier, Luke Cage, Daredevil, Invisible Woman, Human Torch, Hercules, Namor the Submariner, Cloak and Dagger, which are two people, Young Avengers, which is an entire team, and then Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange is a interesting one though because he supports Cap's side. However, he stays hands off basically the entire books. He's not really in them. But for the street level people that were on Cap's side is Spider-Man, Iron Fist, Jessica Jones, Black Panther, and the Punisher. Punisher I thought was a really interesting one, obviously, because Captain America would and has never supported Punisher's actions. So for them to be on the same side, it was a very interesting dynamic. For the people that weren't really involved at all in it were Thor. He was dead at the time. I think I said earlier that he was off-world, but that was wrong. I forgot. He was actually dead at the time. Hulk was off-world, though. Silver Surfer and the X-Men, mostly neutral, saw it as a human problem rather than a mutant problem. So they weren't very much involved. Also, I do think it's important to not really look at them as teams as like a superhero team kind of way. It was really just friends forced into opposing moral corners, heroes acting out of fear, guilt, and principle, alliances that never fully healed or got together. It's different. You can't really look at it as like the good side and the bad side, which is I think is the best part of the story in general. But yeah, we're gonna move into Civil War II now, which I've always liked Civil War II more. I understand that the original Civil War obviously had more of an impact and it was more important to the general Marvel Universe as a whole. But I really liked the moral quandary that caused Civil War II. I think that is one of the greatest stories arcs ever in Marvel. Probably my top 4 of all time. So before I completely wrap up the first Civil War, I know you guys are probably tired of hearing about it by now and you're ready for the Civil War II, but I did want to just go over a little bit more on the main differences between the Civil War movie and the book itself, because Marvel's pretty good at adapting storylines to fit their own narrative of the universe they're building themselves. That's why I don't like to think of the mainline Marvel Cinematic Universe to be the same universe as the mainline comic universe, because there's a lot of differences. But I think the main thing that's wildly different from other than the things that caused it and then some of the events that took place throughout it, are just the character lineups for the main universe, or for the Marvel universe, like cinematic universe, because they're wildly different. And I think it does kind of truly change the meaning of Civil War. I think in the movie it's a lot less of a Civil War than it is in the book. But obviously in the comic and in the movie, Captain America is the core leader for the Anti-Superhuman Registration Act. In the in the book, he surrenders voluntarily. In the movie, he doesn't surrender. Obviously, Bucky plays a lot bigger of a part in the movie than he does in the comic book. I'd like to think about it as a comic book Captain America fights for more of a civil liberties kind of thing. What he thinks is right, what he thinks is against the Constitution, what he thinks is morally right. And the MCU Cap fights more for loyalty, and really that's it. He's really just more fighting for... He's trying to stay together with the people that he's currently with. It's a lot more towards, and then especially the end is a lot more aimed towards Bucky and his friendship with him than it is the awful side of everything. And then obviously on the other side, we have Iron Man leading the charge in both the MCU and the comic universe. In the comics, he's much more the person behind the Registration Act rather than just someone who supports it. He builds Prison 42, also authorizes the Thor clone. In the MCU, he supports the Sokovia Accords, obviously, more out of guilt and grief of what he witnessed and or what the Avengers have caused. In the MCU, Age of Ultron, they dropped the entire country out of the sky. In the first Avengers, they destroyed New York. And then obviously his movies, it's a lot more based on what has happened to him and including him than it is in the comics. And honestly, this might be a controversial take, but I think that the comic book Tony Stark, I don't think they did as well of a job writing him than they did in the movie. In the comics, it was a lot more like a strategic crossing of ethical lines that he was willing to do basically anything to try to get what he stands behind to be the right thing. But in the MCU, it's really he's just an emotionally broken man who is just reacting to everything that he's experienced and the trauma that he's experienced. And I think that's a really big difference, and I think that they did a lot better job getting you to really feel for him than they did in the comic book. But to be fair, in the comic, that wasn't really the goal of his character. So obviously that's a bit different. And then obviously Spider-Man was a big one for the movie and the comics. In the comics, he was much more of a central figure. He publicly unmasked, switches sides, Aunt May gets shot. I think he's a much bigger part in the comic than he actually is in the movie. Not saying he's not a big part of the movie. Obviously, that was the introduction of him to the MCU. Really, him in that movie kind of is just more of a big part for the MCU in general, getting a hold of Spider-Man again, than it is himself in that movie. Obviously, in the MCU, he was recruited by Tony, a new recruit. No identity reveal, no moral arc inside of the conflict. It's just kind of just it. And I like to think about it as the comic book of Civil War kind of runs through Peter Parker. He comes out the other end with his life basically destroyed. In the MCU, it just kind of introduces him. It's a completely different character arc, completely different reasons behind everything he does in that. And then obviously just from the heavy hitters in the actual comic book that weren't in the movie, obviously the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards, Sue Storm, Johnny Storm was in there too, but obviously in the comics, Reed Richards was pro-registration, morally compromised. Sue Storm switches sides after Goliath's death. In the MCU, they weren't present at all, obviously. They get introduced in the newer movie that just came out, but I think the biggest thing that we lose just having those characters in it is just the intellectual and family fracture that occurred, because obviously they are all actually a family. It's not just a team like the Avengers or like the X-Men. And speaking of the X-Men, obviously they're missing from the comic as well, or from the movie as well. Not that they were really too much in the comic anyway. In the comics, they were mostly neutral, kind of staying out of it. They saw it more as of a humanity problem than it was a mutant problem. And then the MCU, they obviously weren't there at all. A rights issue. I honestly don't think it... I think if they were more involved in the comic and then involved at all in the movie, it would have greatened the scale of the conflict, but that's really about it, because they weren't too involved in the movie or in the comic, then it really didn't make much of a difference for the movie, in my opinion. Thor wasn't involved in the movie or the comic book. In the comics, he was dead, replaced by the clone that kills Goliath, so in a way, Thor is a big part of the comic, but not him himself. And then the MCU, he was off-world. I do think that was a bit of a big impact. They had a similar thing with War Machine getting hurt, but even then he didn't die, so I don't think it was as big of a thing. And that happened at the final battle, or the final battle between them all. There wasn't the, oh my god, what have we done moment, that big one that they had in the comic. And then obviously Hulk wasn't in either one either. In the comics, he was off-world on Planet Hulk. In the MCU, he escaped after Ultron, also off-planet and Sakaar. And really the only thing that this avoids is having like an uncontrollable escalation factor, because obviously if the Hulk was on one side, it'd be pretty hard to stop that side. But the team rosters and all for the comics, for the main team roster was Iron Man, Mr. Fantastic, Hank Pym, Miss Marvel, She-Hulk, Vision, and Black Widow. And then for the MCU was Iron Man, War Machine, Black Panther, Vision, Black Widow eventually defected over there. And then Spider-Man. For Captain's side in the comics, it was Captain America, Falcon, Luke Cage, Daredevil, Spider-Man, Invisible Woman, and Punisher. Obviously, Spider-Man was later on after he switched sides. And in the MCU, it was Captain America, Falcon, the Winter Soldier, Scarlet Witch, Hawkeye, and Ant-Man. In the MCU, I think for both sides, it's much more of a family, defending families, and a personal alliances sort of thing. And then in the comics, it was definitely an institutional power for the pro side, and then for the anti side, it was an ideological resistance. They didn't believe in a lot of the stuff. Another big one was obviously Goliath wasn't in either one. In the comics, Goliath gets killed by Thor's clone. In the MCU, there is not a single hero death during the conflict, which, in my opinion, absolutely lowers the scales of the conflict. In the MCU, it's a reversible conflict. In the comics, it's much more of a permanently scarring conflict. Obviously, in the end, in the comics, Cap surrenders, registration stays, Cap is assassinated, and the universe fractures. In the MCU, Cap breaks his team out of prison, Tony and Steve fall out, no law enforcement collapse, relationship damage, so societal damage. It's on a much, much, much smaller scale in the actual movies than it is in the comic books. Why do they feel so different? They are different. I like to think a lot, the MCU movies are a lot about what they take inspiration from the comics, but they're creating their own story, and that's very much what they did with this one. In the comic books, it was a societal trauma, fear in politics, irreversible consequences. You couldn't really just step back from what happened in those books. It took Marvel years to get over it, and in some ways they still aren't. I think, if not one of the most impactful comic books to ever be written in Marvel. Obviously in the MCU, there was tragic breakup between friends, but they both end up working together again in later movies, so it's not an irreversible thing. They're basically telling completely different stories under the same name. That's about it. But for when there are movies and stuff that tie into these kind of stories, I do think it's important to go over them and just kind of compare and contrast the differences, because obviously it's a pretty big difference. These stories aren't just retold in live action. They are parts taken in, parts taken out. And they're creating their own stories for their own universe. It's not the same universe, and I think that's an important thing to look at. But that's about all for Civil War 1. I appreciate you listening. I think I'm going to separate Civil War 1 and Civil War 2, so look forward to that next week. But that's all for this week. I appreciate you guys watching. I hope everyone has a good night or a good day whenever you're listening to this. And Dr. Panel out.